Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second in our series of the future of residential development. It's really good to see so many of you joined us again today, and a few new faces as well. So hopefully we'll have an enjoyable afternoon and engaging conversation later on following the presentations. Just to recap, in the first webinar 2 weeks ago, we heard from Giles Dobson and Mark Buddle talking about the changing roles of house builders, promoters and landowners in residential development moving forward. We then went on to discuss one potential model, which is landowners taking a longer term role in development. It's fair to say it's not sort of one size fits all and isn't suitable for all schemes, but this approach can work for landowners with a vested interest in maximising value and potentially generating long-term income streams, as well as having a vision and desire for quality and legacy. This afternoon, we're going to hear from Mark again and Nick Pettit, who's the head of our project management team, as we look in more detail at some of the options for delivery. They'll explore some of the opportunities and risks involved with this approach, and use one of our current schemes in Surrey as a case study to talk through this. It's going to be the same format as we had 2 weeks ago, so we'll have about 20 minutes for presentations, and then should leave us about 20 minutes for Q&A. So encourage everyone to submit your questions as they come to mind, and we'll try and get through as many of those as we can before the end of the session at 2:45. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Mark to start the presentations.
Thank you, Neil, and good afternoon once again to all those who tuned into the first seminar, and welcome to everyone who's listening for the first time. Thank you for joining us for what I hope will be another interesting and thought-provoking seminar. And please, as Neil said, please do submit your questions. But again, as Neil said, we discussed in the first webinar that there is a growing recognition and a growing reliance that new garden villages and new towns will have to play a much more significant role in meeting the UK's housing need to ensure that we can, over the next few decades, help to resolve the country's housing crisis. Garden towns and villages planned correctly can and will deliver sustainable new communities and take development pressure off less sustainable locations or forms of development on the edge of our towns and cities that will simply not be able to cope with the country's housing demand in isolation. However, what looks good on paper needs to deliver in practice. And this afternoon, as Neil has said, we'll be focusing on driving value through development management and how these new settlements and communities can actually be delivered on the ground. Delivery of infrastructure is key to bringing these new settlements forward. The interplay between the provision of quality infrastructure and building quality settlements with houses, workplaces, public open space, utilities, leisure and social spaces is crucial to building communities that will be fit for the future. As you can see, so John Armitt, chair of the National Infrastructure Commission, says, well-designed infrastructure can play a crucial role in addressing some of the most serious constraints on housing and ensuring that new houses become homes, built in the right place and supporting the long-term needs of local people and businesses. Furthermore, the Institute of Civil Engineers in their 2019 report stated the nation connecting infrastructure with housing states that infrastructure is the fabric of our society that binds our communities together. It strengthens the connections between people and places, creating vibrant and sustainable communities. House builders, by definition, are in the business to build houses, but increasingly over the past few decades, they have been relied upon, either directly or indirectly, to deliver a long list of features that make up our new communities. Utilities, transport, nature, public open space, schools, leisure facilities, and mixed uses are among the broader placemaking themes that house builders have been building as part of delivering large-scale housing projects. As a result, house builders have had to take on the role of master developers, as well as being a house builder. This approach has been and become the norm for delivery of large housing sites on a scale in excess of, say, 800 to 1,000 units. There are, of course, pros and cons with this method, and we are not saying that it is not an appropriate option going forward, but the approach can end up having an impact on values, can lead to sites being underwater on day one. Cash flow and return on capital employed are critical issues for house builders, And once you add on the value of the upfront infrastructure and Section 106 costs and onto the upfront land value, the result often means that there are disputes between landowners and developers over the value of the land. This can lead to significant delays in delivering these sites. Despite these sites generally benefiting from outline planning permission, if development cannot start, this will have an impact on local planning authorities' anticipated housing trajectory figures. This can have a knock-on impact on their 5-year housing land supply assessments and could result in other sites that are not allocated in their local plans being won on appeal against the desire of the local community and the local planning authority. This is why we have, in recent years, seen a greater focus on the physical delivery of sites as part of the local plan process. It is no longer a case of having to demonstrate that the planning merits of a site are appropriate. It is also necessary to ensure that sites can be delivered within the local authority's anticipated housing trajectory timeframes. The other issue with this model, traditional model, is that it's very restricted to who can actually deliver these sites. Infrastructure challenges are a major burden and a major barrier to entry, as the capital commitment is normally such that it rules out many of the smaller and medium house builders. A couple of years ago, the Federation of Master Builders carried out their own house builder survey. And what emerged from this was that despite the government's initiatives such as the Home Building Fund and the Housing Infrastructure Fund, which provides, both of which provide development finance for infrastructure, around 54% of small and medium-sized house builders have admitted that accessing finance is still a major barrier to their capacity to deliver more housing. As a result, these large sites have only really been brought forward by the larger PLCs who have the balance sheets to be able to commit to their delivery. That's assuming that they've been able to reach agreement with the landowners in the first place. This is bound to have an impact on the government's commitments to addressing the housing crisis in the UK. So, how can we, as an industry, open up more opportunities for housing delivery? The traditional method is still appropriate and can still work on large sites, but alternative ways to deliver these large sites have emerged and will continue to be refined as more and more garden villages and towns are developed across the country. The first of these is master developer role, and the second is what we've termed the turnkey model. Dealing with the master developer role first, it is the role of the master developer to take the project responsibility from conception all the way through to implementation. The master developer helps to turn wholesale land into retail land. This has a number of positive benefits for house builders and the development industry as a whole. The master developer approach delivers a range of fully serviced land parcels, which opens up the market, which in turn helps to increase overall absorption rates. It enables house builders to outsource site-wide planning risk, infrastructure provision, and external environmental considerations. This can often help to speed up planning and helps to create flexible approaches that are needed for the quality and diverse delivery of our development sites. It allows house builders to concentrate on the design, construction, and marketing of their houses without the added distraction of having to deliver the wider infrastructure burden. It allows master developers to deliver at scale so that they are able to de-risk issues at the earliest opportunity and leverage their investments to maximise opportunities. The master developer will seek to accelerate site-wide infrastructure wherever possible, and this is a really important aspect in being able to create communities as soon as possible. This is particularly important for new settlements that will rely on these services and infrastructure from day one, for example, new schools, local centres and public open space facilities. This will help to draw people into these new settlements and will ultimately help to add value as people will see that they are buying into an existing community rather than buying into another bland housing site with no facilities. The provision of early infrastructure can also be habit forming for residents. Research has shown that when residents move to a new place, they go with a spirit of adventure. So if a reliable bus route and local shops are, for example, delivered up front, people will be able and more inclined to rely upon them. Or if there is a good running track or a good trim trail, people will use it, helping to build better and healthier places for us to live. If public transport or shops follow later, residents will have already adapted their pre-existing habits so that there is less opportunity for positive change and viability. The master developer option will preserve house builders' cash, and I'm sure most CEOs of house builders will be delighted to hear that. Thus, they will be able to concentrate and secure their return on capital. It creates a level playing field for all sizes and types of house builders to compete, and a multi-channel route to market for the end product. This will help to open up the market to more SMEs who are currently saying that access to land is perhaps an even bigger hurdle to the barrier that I've already discussed about access to finance. It should also help to speed up the delivery of sites. Finally, master developers often agree design codes that represent a statement of partnership between the master developer, the local planning authority, and the house builders who will ultimately have the responsibility for building out these service land parcels to a mutually agreed standard and quality. As an alternative delivery option is one that Bidwells has termed the Turnkey Service. This is an approach that Bidwells is currently exploring with a few of our larger landowner clients, and involves a more patient investment approach to delivering these new settlements and communities, thereby creating added value in the long term. The approach will still meet the planning needs, but it will also help to maintain quality and long-term value for the landowners and any associated investors. And this largely involves around the landowner taking the role of master developer. As we had discussed on the previous webinar, large landed estates and institutional landowners are prepared to invest for the future by pursuing a long-term investment in how they can deliver new communities and adding value along the way. Bidwells is currently providing a service for some of our clients where we acquire an opportunity. We then take it through the planning process, and then we actually help deliver these projects on the ground. Here our clients are contemplating taking a much longer term investment income by retaining interests in land and property, as we've discussed before, whether that is housing, local centres, employment space, or the management of the country parks and open space. Bidwells is able to provide this turnkey service and work with our clients to deliver these new communities a full-blown project management role from conception through to implementation and delivery of the finished product. And without wanting to steal any more of Nick's thunder, I'll hand you over to Nick, who will delve into greater detail into the development and project management role and how we can help to drive value for our clients and landowners.
Thanks, Mark. I don't know whether just our guys on the panelists can hear. Is my speech is broken up as Mark's is, or is it a bit clearer?
It's yours is clearer, Nick. I think it's just a bit of interviews on Mark's connection, but crack on.
Apologies about that, everybody. And if you've got questions, then please do pose them back into us as soon as you can. The turnkey solution that Mark's talked about won't suit every landowner, won't suit every investor. It will be another strand to the residential development market that will take up and provide a proportion of deliverability to the overall housing need. Specifically, we think that the long-term investor, the pension fund, is likely to be the sort of charities and perpetual investor are likely to be those that will take this up. What we're not looking to do is anything that is particularly innovative and special. George Cadbury started this in Bourneville in the early 1900s. We're not quite going as far as they anticipated, but we are using some of those principles of community and engagement. Mark's mentioned that we are doing this for a number of our clients. We've got 4 options at the moment which we're looking at. The specific one which we're going to concentrate on today is the Dunsfold Park, which is a World War II airbase based in the rolling hills of Surrey. It has gained planning consent in the last year for the first phase of 1,800 homes, and there's a hope that we can produce nearly 3,500 homes maybe in the long-term future, but we'll see where that one goes to. Now, the important part is for us to create value. There's no point in doing this if we're not getting a return on capital employed. And this is the key metric that we work with all the way through the master developer role. But the differential here is that the long-term value and the money embedded in the project are further down the line. This is why it's not for every investor. The perpetual investor, the landowner who is quite prepared to leave money in the project for longer term, is where this opportunity is really targeted at. If we look at our example project, what we can see is that probably the peak borrowing will come in at around about 3 to 5 years, depending upon the scale at which we push the development forward on. Break-evens may well be out to 4 to 5 years, but the real return on the capital starts to come in at between 5 and 10 years, depending upon the scale at which we're pushing forward on. But the long-term capital receipt is where the real value comes in, and that we're expecting, and what we can see from our modelling, is that this is likely to generate between 15 and 20% uplift on market value from those where we are seeing more traditional development routes taking place. So how do we achieve this? Well, the master developer remains embedded in the project. We're embedded to ensure that we're creating that value. We want to create the community, we want to create the sustainability, we want to create the environment, and that must have linked with it a long-term strategic plan. This is not about selling a parcel of land and exiting the site as quick as we can. At Dunsfold, we think we're in for a 10-year role on the management of the site overall. And this means that what we've got to do is create our own community trust, which will seek to deliver many of the core operational parts of the site, and not just be the traditional grass cutting, road sweeping function. We don't think there's a great deal of value in this type of facility being pushed into an adoption model with the local authority, because we think the quality will start to wane over a period of time. And ultimately, the branding, the quality and the environment that you create will help sell the houses. So we have to maintain that all the way through. Now, when we talk about environment and sustainability, we're going to be pushing the boundaries here of where many developments sit at the moment. We know that the Future Home Standard comes in 2025, but what we're seeking to do is already adopt the sustainability and environmental standards that the RIBA have outlined in their 2030 targets, which would exceed the government's 2050 targets by 20 years. Now, that will be a challenge because it's bringing forward development, both in terms of sustainability for the overall environment that we're delivering, but also in the delivery of the houses and how we're cutting down on embedded energy in the construction of houses. We're then looking at the sustainability and life cycle costing of the residential developments as well, so that we can try to give benchmarks to purchasers in terms of how much cost of operation they're saving through the life cycle of the project. The creation of the work-life balance and the work-live balance is critical, so houses will need to have that adaptability and functionality within them. And the diversity of engaging with all community members in how they want their accommodation to be delivered, how functional it is, how accessible it is for all age ranges, it needs to be considered. And then finally, if you can do, and then particularly on the site that we're talking about in Surrey, we are blessed with quite a lot of wider land area. We can look at the well-being standards and how you create the community around well-being options and what sports functions, what walking, what allotments you can have, all of those elements coming into creating a cultured environment they will be brought forward in our project. So how do we control that? Well, that's the difficult bit, really. We have agreed with the local authority a very clear master plan framework. That master plan has been signed off by the local authority and embeds all of our thinking that we've just talked about. The design principles, they seek to give guidance to the residential developers around what we're expecting to have in those locations and how they must respond to us when they're returning their bids on the project. Both of those two former documents are local authority approved, as well as the master developer. But the real nub of it comes down to the design code. We have to put some very rigorous constraints into our design code to allow, first of all, the residential developer to respond to us, but also to ensure that those obligations and those measures that we want embedded all the way through the project to create that vision, to create that environment, are delivered on every parcel that's offered to the marketplace. So the design code is something that every offer that comes back in for the residential parcels will be measured against. And we will obviously have to sign that off. So what are we actually delivering? What's the differential here? Well, the differential in our eyes is that we are going to be delivering serviced parcels of land, which are free of 106 cost, which have all of the core services integrated within them. They have the main distributor roads completed, that have proportions of the country park available on day one. They have the community sports, village centre, schools and transport systems embedded. And we're even looking at potential concierge delivery services and allotments being allocated very early on in the process. So there's a tangible community already embedded at the very outset of the project. Now, our challenges. You're probably all picking up on this one very, very easily, is the viability in our modelling. We have to continue to look at the infrastructure costs and the long-term viability and land value income to see that this is going to be justifiable. If we spent more than 35% of the overall capital receipt on the early infrastructure costs, then we're going to be chasing our tail all the way through this project. So there are some key metrics which we need to have in place to make sure that the viability will be successful over the longer term of the project. Our question is, will the residential development market be interested in what we're saying? Because we were putting down a series of constraints that are challenging to them and may force them to be thinking a lot harder about the requirements that they've got to deliver and what the end user wants. Will we achieve that 15 to 20%? And time will have to tell on that one. And can we set up an operational trust that really can be the community engagement tool that facilitates those early pioneers that come in and want to occupy the site? So they're the challenges that we have to try and meet. So how confident are we about this? Well, we've been doing some market research, and that market research has shown that the core principles that we're trying to create in the community model are absolutely loved by the local authority, and the residential developers are responding to it in a positive way, because it allows them to take up their preferred route, the preferred route of being the retailer of houses, not having to embed lots of money into the core infrastructure. The whole story behind the development model and how the master developer will stay involved and stay into the site is liked by the residential homes purchasers, because they can see that there is some skin in the game. They want to maintain we want to maintain our position there, and that that will help deliver our land value uplift. But have we been able to prove that 15–20% is necessarily available or achievable? Well, therein lies one of our slightly difficult questions, because just as we were starting our market testing on this front, the COVID pandemic came along, and we're still in the process of making sure that we can deliver all of these value uplifts that are indicated by discussion with developers. So what we can see is that this is a credible alternative in terms of how we could deliver development sites. We can see that the key stakeholders, the local authority and the residential developers, are very keen on this as a model. What we've still got to prove is that return on the capital employed, but we don't see at this stage any reason why we would not have that value created in the long term. And then what we can do is create these engaging, enjoyable communities for all to live in. Thank you for listening to us. I think we're going to open the floor now to a series of questions. And I'll hand you back to Neil to chair this.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Mark. Thanks so much for the presentations. Food for thought in terms of what you're setting out, and sort of interesting using sort of real life example, Nick, in terms of trying to bring that to life. I suppose sort of start of a 10, obviously sort of slightly sort of alternative mode for delivery. How would you go about sort of convincing landowners that this is the right route to go down? Why is this alternative route something potentially that is better than the traditional modes that people have become used to?
Are you addressing that to me or to Mark?
I'll stay with you. I'll stay with you, Nick, first, just as you just finished off your presentation. We'll come to Mark.
Thank you. Well, it's very, you know, it might not be the landowner that stays in. It might be that actually there is a perpetual investor that comes along. You know, we're very lucky with the Dunsfold site insofar as it's a Trinity investment. You know, they're quite prepared to look at the long-term gain on their money. And I think that they're the people that you've got to look at. That sort of organisation is the type of organisation that is going to be key to look at this type of delivery model. So what are we doing? Well, it's a higher risk. It's a higher risk because what you're doing is there could be failings. Items could go wrong. But you know, with prudent, careful management of the project, which is where we lie. We're undertaking that careful project management throughout the delivery process. You should be able to manage your risk with the quality of the environment, the sustainability elements. What you're trying to do all the time is to create enhancement to the value, and you know, as I say, it won't be for all, but if people want that enhanced value and they're prepared to take a long-term view, then why wouldn't you invest in this sort of opportunity?
And Mark, just taking that on, because it's sort of touched on the point that actually, rather than sort of taking roles away from the house builders, is potentially is more of interest. It's taking up sort of a role of infrastructure delivery and sort of locking up investment on their sort of balance sheet that otherwise they'd probably rather be spending on new opportunities. So sort of where do you sit on that in terms of the interplay with the house builders and how you convince a landowner that this is a route they should be going down?
As I said, and we've said before, and we said last webinar, that this is not an approach that is a one-size-fits-all. This is a new or an alternative approach to what's happened and what's currently happening, and we're just looking at new ways to being able to open up opportunities to deliver these large, new, strategic communities that are going to have to be delivered over the next few years to reach the housing numbers that we're going to need to develop. So I think it is a new approach. House builders, as I said in my presentation, house builders and their CEOs and their finance directors, I'm sure will be delighted to see that they could be spending money on retail land rather than on wholesale land, and then ploughing tens of millions or hundreds of millions of pounds into infrastructure provision, which they won't get a return on for a number of years. So if there are landowners out there or investors who are prepared to take a more patient approach, I think that the house builders should embrace that, and I hope, and I'm sure they will. We're aware of other, there are companies out there who are taking on board this approach at the moment, the Urban and Civics of the world, and what they seem to have done is opened up the market to the other house builders other than just the big PLCs, and they are able to deliver, that product to a wider, diverse SME marketplace. They're also able to develop quality and build quality, and I think that's the point from the landowner's perspective, that if you've got a long-term investment and a long-term interest, whether that would just be a 10-year investment play, or whether it's you actually want to retain property, land, in, for generations to come, then you're going to care about what it looks like, what it feels like, and you're going to make sure that the product is delivered to a much better quality. If you deliver to a quality, it's proven that you can then add value. So yeah, it's not an approach everyone is going to want to adopt, but it is an alternative approach that we think will become more and more pertinent as we look to develop more and more bigger new towns and villages.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Just stay with you, Mark. Obviously, sort of Nick mentioned that this gives the potential to deliver returns maybe 15 to 20% higher than a traditional approach, but obviously that's over a longer period of time. Where do you think that 15 to 20% is coming from? And we sort of a question here from Patrick Vickerman. How have we arrived at that? Is that just we're taking the 15 to 20% that the master developer who hasn't been appointed we're just soaking up their margin, or is this also about the focus on quality and setting the benchmark at an early stage will then drive values over the long term?
I think it's both, Neil. Yeah, I think it is both. I mean, it's well known that there's an uplift in turning a wholesale strategic land site into retail. What that is, different people will put different margins against that, but that could be a 5-10% increase in value from just turning wholesale land into retail land. And then if you can build in the quality and the provision and do all the things that we've spoken about in our presentations about getting it right on day one, if you get these things wrong on day one, the big risk is that you're going to take years to recover. If you get it right on day one, you should end up embracing the new communities and adding value. So I think it's really important. Nick's role as project management on these projects is going to be absolutely critical in making sure that the returns, and they're not proven, they're not tried and tested. This is a model that we're running. In 5 years' time, we'll come back and we'll be able to tell you how successful we really have been. And I hope, and I truly believe that we will actually probably be better than those margins if we get it right, and I'm sure we will get it right.
Okay. Look, Nick, I'll come to you in a second, just picking up the point on risk, but it's just a follow-up question that we got from John Woodward. It's sort of aligned with the value, saying, is value purely financial returns, or is it something else? I know, Mark, it's probably, I've got to stay with you because it's something that you and Giles touched on the first webinar about what is value on these schemes.
Absolutely. I mean, value is almost very difficult to quantify. Yes, it's pounds, shillings, and pence to some, but to others, it's what does it look like? How does it feel? How does it, what's it going to look like in generations to come? If you're a landed estate, which has been around for hundreds of years, you're going to want to build something and be involved in something which is going to look good for not only for the estate, but the estates are the integral parts of their local communities and the towns in which they are located. So they want to buy into that. So value is more than just pounds, shillings, and pence. And for some landowners, it's almost impossible to quantify what that aesthetic value is.
Thanks, Mark.
And I'd add, Neil, there that the value is really the value to the investor is one element, but the value to the occupier of the houses and the community that you build is probably the legacy that you want to make sure you're leaving. And if you can create that community feel at the very outset of the project with all of these embedded elements within it, then the financial value should be an easy thing to come out of it at the very end. So it's twofold: value to the investor, value to the occupier.
Brilliant, thank you, Nick. Nick, staying with you, sort of clearly this model results in the landowner taking on significantly more risk than they would do with just literally selling the land or bringing on a partner who will then manage that risk moving forward. How do you see your role or the role of a development manager in helping to mitigate that risk? So is it any different to what a house builder or lead developer would typically be doing, or is it just the same?
Well, the risk components are very similar, Neil. If you have ground condition issues, if you have design related matters that you don't resolve early on, if you have capacity problems in offsite infrastructure, those exist for whether you are the master developer in a more traditional role or whether you're a master developer in the role that we're talking about here, which is the turnkey solution. So these risks don't go away from the land; they are embedded within the development that exists on the site overall. So in the same way that in the traditional format, you are trying to find out what those risk components are and how and manage them as best you can. That is what we're doing. We're merely replacing our position into the position where the more traditional residential developer has sat. So I don't think there's anything different in terms of how you're managing the risk, but risk needs to be managed. And there are multiple ways of trying to offset specific risks on projects, whether you're sharing that with maybe the civil engineering contractor in some way, whether you're sharing that with the IGNO provider, whether you're sharing that with maybe the housing developer as they come on board and take one of the zones that you're delivering. There are quite a lot of ways in which you can share that risk around to try and mitigate and protect against it. So there's no magic bullet there. We're just doing. We're actually just very focused on managing risk overall.
But I think just picking up on that as well, Neil. Sorry, Nick picks a good point. Really, is if you can get a few other people to actually buy into the whole concept as well. So your utility providers, rather than just having huge upfront costs, let them buy into it, and then you can sell added services. The whole broadband, the whole fiber things. All of that is stuff and value that they'll be having from those houses for years to come.
Yes.
So why do they end up having to put in a huge cost up front? Why can't we just look at an alternative model? Let's go out there and be a bit creative, be a bit different, think outside the box.
Well, that's very much where our viability model is sitting at the moment on our scheme in Surrey, is that we can see that there is a return on it. We can see where the peak debt is. We can see where our returns will come from. And now what we're trying to do is factor that back by actually having these conversations about providers and seeing what relevant income you can get in and managing all the different spend profiles to a better degree, so that we can share and enhance value at the end.
Cool. I mean, just staying on a similar theme, as we sort of talk about thinking creatively and sort of bringing people on board to share risk. I mean, we've got a number of sort of house builders on the webinar this afternoon. Is a danger that they might be looking at this thinking this is just us advocating landowners rowing their own boats and closing off the opportunity to them. Where do you see the opportunities for other partners coming on board? Are there opportunities there? What are the entrance points for them to work on schemes like this further down the line?
I think it depends on each individual's site and opportunity will be different, Neil, but I suspect most of these landowners are going to want to take the planning on themselves, so they're going to self-promote. So you're not going to bring many people in on those parties. It's really post-planning, and then how are you going to deliver the infrastructure and then delivering the houses. So I think the turnkey service and the master developer role we've kind of outlined earlier is more for house builder and service lands, rather than maybe having the whole load of partnerships. Now this is a small element of what is a huge market out there. So we're not advocating that house builders are going to be out of business in terms of running on large sites. That this is just an alternative approach that we think is an appropriate one to look at to help deliver a number of the large strategic sites that are going to need to be required to bring forward the housing numbers in the future.
Nick, anything else that you want to add on that, or does that cover it nicely?
No, I think Mark's covered it there, really.
Then just on that, in terms of sort of we sort of refer to house builders, but again, sort of we don't want to sort of pigeonhole this. There's a question from Mark Smith saying, are you factoring in a percentage reduction in value attributable to multiple developers delivering on site at the same time? So probably look at that sort of saturation or absorption rate that any site can hold. Nick, sort of obviously using Dunsfold as an example, how are you sort of addressing this in terms of trying to accelerate delivery without flooding the market?
Well, I think the key component here is actually looking at the different marketplaces that exist. So it's not looking at saying, well, we just have multiple house builders delivering their different models on the site overall. What we're factoring in and what we're trying to factor in is the components of your traditional end sale house, obviously a component of affordable, a PRS model where we can and when we can. and then later living, because actually you need all those components to make the community. So if you can try and get some of those bits moved away earlier, and therefore your absorption rate becomes a bit quicker because you've got 4 or 5 different marketplaces that you're selling into, that's how we're going to try and do it. It's not just saying we've got 4 of the same housing developers delivering 4 slightly different boxes on a site, because that would be pointless. You wouldn't get anybody bidding for it. It would just be, we would look silly if we did that.
And I think that's another way why these new sustainable developments are going to be different. You know, 1,000 unit site on the edge of a town is probably 1,000 unit site on the edge of the town. It'll have elements of affordable housing and probably a school and a local community centre or local centre. But we're talking about sites and new communities here that are going to be villages. You know, they're going to have lots of different aspects to them. So it'll be employment, it will be, you know, retirement, it will be living, care living, it will be all the things Nick's talked about, PRS, build to rent, self-build even. You know, we shouldn't shy away from that. That's something which the government is keen to promote as well. So I agree with Nick entirely. You know, it's not going to be 4 flags flying, all of the same, chasing the same end user. It's going to be 4 different markets looking at different individuals.
Excellent, thanks. I'm conscious of time. It's that the Q&A session is flying by. I just want to try and get in a sort of couple of questions just before we start wrapping up. Question from Erin Elliott. Can this theoretically work in areas of low value and with high remediation needs or high infrastructure costs?
Shall I take that one, Nick? I think it's harder, is the honest answer. And I suspect that there are, as a price sensitive point at which this isn't going to work, this model. So as we say, it's not a one size fits all. This will have to be carefully looked at and considered at the outset as to whether it's a viable model in all locations. And I suspect in a lot it won't be, but in other ways that it will be a very viable option, and particularly where you can add further value. You know, if you're talking of 3, 4, 5, 10, 20,000 houses, if you can add 50, £100 a square foot to the value, boy, you're making some big money and you can make some big investments.
Excellent, thanks, Mark. And just want to hear from Hugo Upton, where it's probably along the lines of landowners that might be minded to go down this route, but just in terms of the costs involved of delivery of the infrastructure, he's just asking, are there grants or loans available to pump prime and fund infrastructure delivery? It probably brings in the role of Homes England. Again, probably staying with you, Mark, to pick that one up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I talked about the HIF fund, and there are other government funds out there. I mean, one of the things that I would plead is that the government tried to actually just end up with a fund or a couple of funds rather than lots of different funds, which nobody really knows their way around, and to make that system a lot easier to understand. But yeah, absolutely, there are funding mechanisms. Homes England, we know, are ploughing in, you know, tens of millions, hundreds of millions into helping facilitate the delivery of sites. And if you're going to do it right, I don't see why they shouldn't help here in these situations as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. I'm conscious that we're pretty much running out of time. There's some sort of interesting questions that have come in, which are sort of probably picking up, Nick, on some of your presentation, where it's asking about the technological solutions we're adopting to meet the higher levels of environmental performance, and what the impact and viability is of adopting these higher standards at an earlier stage. I think these are probably really interesting questions that it's probably better that we roll over to the next session, because it leads us into it quite nicely, because the third in our series will look at balancing the costs of building better, and that will be on the 30th of July, and actually sort of Nick, Mark and some of the rest of the team will be joining us there, where we start sort of weighing up some of the decisions that we're making, and the impact that has on viability and the returns. So thanks very much for those. We won't forget those. We'll carry them over. Thank you very much to Nick and Mark for the presentations and your contribution in the Q&A. Thank you very much for everyone who's joined us this afternoon. I hope that was sort of a useful webinar and given food for thoughts moving forward. If anyone's got any other questions, feel free to sort of send them through to us directly. Happy to pick up offline. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of the day, and look forward to hopefully seeing as many as possible on the 30th of July. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.